without further ado, let me introduce Chris Yeager.
So if you guys, anyone who hasn't yet finished writing their questions, you can feel free to continue writing questions. I'll filibuster for a little bit longer. So just to let you guys know about a little bit more about me, I do in fact have a 9-year-old daughter, Marisa. So like Roger, this is one of the reasons why I feel like doing this is very important. At the age of 9, she is utterly convinced, I think, that she can rule the world, and I'm not going to bet against her. But you know, one of the things I know is, I'm like, gosh, you know, what's going to happen as she gets older? What kind of world is she going to be growing up in? And so it's very important to me to try to do something about that, to make sure that the world that she experiences when she's a teenager, when she's a young woman, is the kind of world I want her to experience. So I really commend everyone for taking part in this, for organizing this, and for setting up the Women's Startup Lab to create an environment where I think women can really learn, open up, be more vulnerable, and be able to do useful things. My own background is, for the sake of Silicon Valley, most people will know I do investing and advising and help out various companies. And in that process, I've had the opportunity to mentor and advise and invest in women entrepreneurs, men entrepreneurs. As I mentioned earlier, I haven't been able to invest in any transgendered entrepreneurs, but I'm sure that's coming some point in time. And so hopefully I'll have enough experience to answer some of these questions in a useful and interesting way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay these out, and I'm just going to start picking them off, and I will hopefully be able to stitch together a useful narrative out of this that will give you guys a coherent sense of life as an entrepreneur. All right, let's see. This is a good one. So why don't we begin? How did you start, and how did you get your first funding? So the thing to bear in mind is that this all took place a fairly long time ago, and as a result, not all of the lessons apply. I got started by getting into the tech industry early. I think I was telling a few folks earlier that I'm fortunate enough to fit into all these different categories that are like the in group for startups. So I'm male of East Asian descent. I went to Stanford as an undergraduate and studied engineering. And so as a result, there's just sort of venture capitalists waiting around saying, hey, look, there's another one of them. But I didn't actually start a company right out of Stanford. I went to work for D.E. Shaw and Company, doing their internet ventures. So we were working on something called Juno Online Services and Farsight Financial Services. And the reason I did this is it was 1994, 1995, and I was just convinced that this internet thing was going to actually be big. And so that's why I went out to the East Coast and worked on this. Now, I worked on these projects. Some of them were pretty successful. Juno ended up going IPO, which is pretty cool, and then eventually merged with Net Zero, which only the older people in the audience will remember. I think they're still actually a publicly traded company, amazingly enough. But I didn't actually get my first funding until after I finished business school, or until after I was in business school. So when I was in business school, again, the timing was very apt. I was in the class of 2000 at Harvard Business School, so that meant my summer job took place in the summer of 1999. And I looked at the situation and I said, there is not a chance in hell that this is going to last. This is the only time in history when investors will be dumb enough to give MBA students money to start companies. So I better take advantage of this. And in fact, because the stock market is so insane, the only rational thing to do is to sell stock. Since I don't have any of it, I need to create some so that I can sell it. And so, over the summer, I started a company with one of my old high school friends and one of my old Stanford classmates. Classic, reaching out to the network. I was fortunate that one of my old high school friends had actually become an internet millionaire and had a bunch of money. And another one of my friends from Stanford was like #2 in the country in computer science, and so I had the right ingredients to start a company. And I began it over the summer when I was in business school instead of taking a summer job. And because I actually decided I wanted to go back to school and finish my degree, I recruited a CEO to come in. We raised first angel money and then venture money, all at the end of 1999 and beginning of 2000. And so one of the things I did to help get my first funding was I basically cheated. I brought in an experienced CEO who already had contacts and investors who had invested in the past, And he was actually able to bring in our first $250,000 angel investor. And one of his previous investors was ended up being the venture capitalist who invested in the company as the lead of the first round. So the lesson out of that is that the only way to start is to start, but that when you're looking to get your funding, sometimes you can cheat. You don't need to do it all on your own. You can have advisors or friends or people who have existing contacts, because let me tell you, if there's anything I know about investors is they really would prefer to invest in someone they know than in a perfect stranger. And even if that someone they know is only an advisor or not the founder of the company, it still helps because there's credibility. This also, I don't know if it's covered in these questions, but it also brings another point that I always make with people, which is people say, wow, Chris, you seem to be so well connected. You know all these people. Somebody was joking the other day, oh yes, and we got in touch with this person because of course he's a close personal friend of Chris Ye, as are another 30% of the people in Silicon Valley. And this is not because I have some grand scheme for networking and meeting people. It's because I go out and I meet people and I stay in touch with them before I ever need them. There are some entrepreneurs I work with or have mentored over the past, and I say, how come you haven't reached out to me for a long time? I'm like, oh, I don't want to bother you. I know you're really busy. I won't bother contacting you until I really need you. I'm like, you realize that what you're training people to do is to think whenever this person contacts me, they want something. Right? So what you should be doing is you should be developing these relationships, especially with investors, before you're ever raising any money. Start developing these relationships, find out, hey, are they interested in learning about a topic that you know something about? Can you help one of their companies? Is there something that you're an expert in that they would love to know about? And start building that relationship now so that when the time comes and you're asking for money, it's not random stranger asking for money, it's my close personal friend Maya asking for money. So that's a very important point in terms of raising money. Okay, next question. What is your favorite advice for entrepreneurs? I'll answer that one because I was talking about this just earlier tonight. My favorite advice for entrepreneurs comes from a guy named Cal Newport, who wrote a number of books about college and succeeding in high school and college. And I think he stole this from someone else, so I don't remember the exact attribution. But the statement is, be so good they can't ignore you. Basically, the point is that there are a lot of reasons why people are going to ignore you. They're busy, they have biases, they may be prejudiced. There are all sorts of reasons why people are going to ignore you. And the easiest way to get around that is not to try to convince them or bring them around to your point of view. It's to simply be so good that they can't ignore you. In the startup world, that means generating traction, generating progress in the marketplace. Because I've seen venture capitalists before. I've spent a lot of time with venture capitalists. They will invest in a company that they don't even understand, with a person that they've barely met, just because it looks like it's doing this. Now, if investors will swallow their pride and invest in people who are probably known criminals, simply because they have traction, they will probably be willing to invest in you, who are not a scumbag and not a known criminal, if you have traction. So number one advice for entrepreneurs, be so good you can't ignore it, they can't ignore you, and the key to that is generating traction. If you have traction, it doesn't matter if you are a scumbag or a crook, someone will still invest in you. All right, other questions. Oh, this is a good one because it is highly relevant to the life you guys are leading right now. What was your biggest mistake and what did you learn from it? Now, it's hard for me to pick a single mistake because I've managed to make so many over the years. So I'll pick a couple of my favorite mistakes and sort of talk about what I learned from this so that hopefully you guys don't have to make the mistakes. The first mistake I'll mention is that you guys know more than you think. When I was a young entrepreneur, I believed, gosh, these are the people, they're richer than me, they're more experienced than me, they must understand how to do this. And so if they tell me to do something that doesn't make sense, well, I'll just do it because you know what, these guys are older and richer and more experienced. They must know what they're doing. But the secret fact is nobody actually knows what they're doing. So if it really doesn't make any sense and you can't find a way that it makes sense, it probably doesn't make sense. So biggest mistake number one, being willing to do things that didn't make sense simply because other people said it made sense. No, don't accept that. You have to actually go in and figure out how it makes sense for yourself. Biggest mistake number two is getting so wrapped up in what you're doing and focusing just on business and building the company all the time that you don't actually take any time to develop relationships or spend time with friends or actually live life. My first company that I started, I was one of these, you know what, I'm just going to spend all the time working kind of people. And I did crazy things like I would call meetings on Sunday morning at 9 a.m. so that we could have more time to work, which, in retrospect was really, really bad, and kind of probably the reason why some of those employees ended up quitting on me. I don't know, just guessing here. But that company did not actually succeed, and afterwards I realized that part of the reason it didn't succeed is because I felt like I just had to do everything on my own, and I was paying no attention to what's going on in the world outside me. I was paying no attention to what other people were doing. And I resolved that that was a mistake, and I was going to fix that. And since then, I focused on maintaining relationships, spending time listening to other people, learning what they have going on. And in terms of being able to raise money, in terms of being able to get help for startups and things like that, it has been immensely better, because now instead of saying, oh, I'm just going to do it all myself, sit down, spend another 10 hours working on spreadsheets, I say, gosh, here's the issue we're facing. I know this person really knows what to do. Let me go reach out to them. And part of that is also helping other people. A friend of mine started a conference, and he asked me, hey, if I build this conference up and it's financially successful, how much can I sell it for? And I told him, I have no idea. But probably Chris Shipley, another woman entrepreneur, would know, because she ran demo for all these years. And I know her. Why don't I write her an email for you and ask her what the answer to that question is? Oh, that would be fantastic. But that's only possible because I know Chris Shipley, because I met a woman who was a dear friend of mine. Sadly, she's passed away now, but I met a dear woman who, at an event. I kept in touch with her, and she asked me and Chris Shipley to be on the advisory board for another startup by another woman founder, by the way, in 2004. So there's a whole chain of unlikely events that leads to a relationship that I can then use to help someone in the present day. And none of that happens if you spend all your time at your desk looking at your spreadsheets. All right. Next question. How can we get more women funded? Since men are biased, do we need more women investors? An excellent question. So the number one thing to remember about investors is that they are lemming-like. And the number two thing to remember about investors is all they care about is generating returns. Because the motivation of a venture capitalist is, I have raised this pot of money from a bunch of pension funds. I had to go out to the middle of nowhere, Tennessee, and get on my hands and knees and beg some college endowment for money. And now I better make a return, or I'm going to be turfed out in 10 years when this fund is over. So the reason that they don't fund women is oftentimes they fall back on pattern recognition. They proudly talk about themselves as being capable of pattern recognition, and so they fund people who are like themselves. I think that's something like if you were to say, look just at the venture capital demographic and say, tell me what proportion of venture capitalists are Caucasian males who went to either Harvard Business School or Stanford Business School, it would have to be at least 30%. I am not exaggerating. It is that tightly concentrated. And so as a result, they tend to feel most comfortable funding people like them. There are women investors, and I've heard mixed things. I think there are some wonderful women investors. I think there are also women investors who people told me they felt like, female entrepreneurs who talked to them felt like, hey, it seemed like they wanted to prove themselves to be tougher than the rest of their partnership, so they were even tougher on me than some of the male investors were. So it's a tricky thing. I think the way that it's going to be fixed is that women are going to start companies. Those companies are going to be successful and make a lot of money. And investors, just like I said, they'll invest in crooks, they'll invest in scumbags. They will surely invest in women if they believe it will help them make money. And I think that it is really important, and one of the things the Women's Startup Lab can do that's really important is to tell the story of successful women founders. Because if there is I'm going to make a gross generalization here, but in general, women founders are less likely to roam around writing guest posts and attempting to tell the world how awesome they are than male founders. And in fact, there are a lot of male founders out there who roam around the world telling everyone how awesome they are, despite the fact that they aren't even successful. I mean, there's a ton of people whose names you see all the time and who are all over the place, who, if you sort of look underneath, aren't actually successful. I suspect I'm one of those people. So providing a space for women to tell the story and telling the story over and over again of women who are successful helps provide the examples that convince women to start companies. Maybe there's a young woman out there who's just thinking about it right now because she knows that someone like her did it, she's going to jump into it. And helps convince investors, hey, I'm missing out. Because if there's anything that investors want, it's to make money so that the pension fund in Tennessee doesn't tell them, I'm not investing in your next fund. And then because a venture capitalist really has no useful skills other than being a venture capitalist, if you can't raise a fund, you're really screwed. Okay. From your perspective, what is the role of a CEO? So I will steal something from my old professor, Bill Solomon. And what Bill Solomon said is the #1 job of the CEO is to not run out of money. And that's the #1 thing. Just don't run out of money. Now, there are different ways to not run out of money. One way to not run out of money is to raise a colossal amount of it. There's pluses and minuses to this. There are actually a lot of minuses to it. Another way is to be profitable and cash flow positive. And the third way is to just keep your expenses so darn low that you don't run out of money. So #1, don't run out of money. And one of the things I was telling Monique and Maya earlier is that if somebody came to you today and said, I'll write you a check for $250,000 for a seed round right now, obviously you take it. And I would tell you to take it because you should always take money. But there's actually a downside to that, which is once you have the money, you're going to start spending it. You're going to start paying people who've been working for free because it isn't fair to keep having them work for free after you've actually got some money in. And then that money's going to be gone very quickly. And then you can't go back to them and say, guess what? Well, it was good while it lasted. Now we've got to go back to not paying you anymore. For some reason, people don't like that. And so it's very difficult to recover once you've run out of money. It does happen. The great example that a lot of people forget, Evan Williams, whom now everyone remembers as, he created Twitter along with Jack Dorsey and Biz Stone. Evan Williams was an entrepreneur, and in the first dot-com boom, he started a company called Pyra Labs that built Blogger, which we all know as that ancient blogging platform that Google somehow still runs. And he started Pyra Labs, he raised some money, they went out there, they were one of the first people to create this web-based blogging software. And they couldn't make any money. Couldn't get anyone to pay for it. And eventually he had to lay everyone else off. He had to lay off all his co-founders. He was living probably on someone's couch and running Blogger. And fortunately for Evan, and fortunately for all of us, Google came along and said, you know what, this is actually really interesting to us. It's a great way to generate a lot of content. We're going to buy you and make you a millionaire. But he went through a process where for 6 months it was just him, awake day and night, keeping the servers running, where he'd had to lay off all of his friends. This stuff happens to even the most successful people imaginable. It's hard to imagine someone you could consider more successful than Evan Williams. But in 2001, he was broke, alone, and probably running Blogger on his credit cards. So don't run out of money. The other role of the CEO is ultimately, I think that it's really important for a CEO to say, I am the person who makes sure that stuff happens when everything else fails. Ultimately, in your organization, if you're the CEO, everyone else can, at the end of the day, go home and say, well, I'll do that tomorrow. Or, we'll figure it out later. Because they're like, oh yeah, I'm just an employee, or I'm just an executive. Somehow we'll get figured out. That somehow is you as the CEO. And so you, as the CEO, are the one person who's going to ultimately be judged on the success or failure of the company. Everyone else, they can always make some excuses. Oh, the timing wasn't right. Oh, this other person didn't know what they were doing. You're the CEO. You have no excuses. And because you have no excuses and because you care more about it than anyone else, you're going to be the person of last resort. So don't run out of money. You're going to be the person of last resort. On the plus side, there are benefits of being CEO. The main thing is that you do get to put your stamp on the company, and that's probably the third important thing, which is building the culture of the company. And the culture of the company is important. I think people have started to finally talk more about culture these days. The culture of the company is really important because ultimately, Facebook, Google, Square, you name it, they can always pay your employees twice as much as you can pay them. So if it comes down to money, you're always going to lose. The only way you're going to win is if you make your company a place where people really want to work. because you just don't have enough money to overcome what other people can pay. And so culture is the only way to build and retain a team these days, and you as the CEO set that culture. You have to live that culture, not just write a mission statement, and you have to be willing to back that culture up so that if somebody is a phenomenal performer but they are doing things the wrong way, they are treating people the wrong way, you have to first warn them and then actually get rid of them if it comes down to that. And it's not easy being CEO, but you guys probably already know that. All right, let's see. Here's an excellent question, because these are questions that are on a lot of people's minds. Is it beneficial to join an accelerator, and is it absolutely necessary to have a technical co-founder to raise seed funding? One at a time. Is it beneficial to join an accelerator? So there are a couple ways in which it can be beneficial to join an accelerator, but the big thing is to decide which benefits you want. So there are a couple of accelerators, like Y Combinator and also AngelPad, and I think Techstars, where just getting in gets you money. Right? Not even the investors, that as part of getting into the program, they actually give you money. Tandem also does that. They're much smaller. They give you,
does that too.
exactly. And so that's useful, right? I mean, that's absolutely useful. $100,000, $200,000, that's really handy to have. It's also the case that certain accelerators have enough of a brand such that they do generate a lot of investor interest. Y Combinator is probably the foremost one. Of course, they have the biggest brand, they have the biggest successes. But beyond that, the other thing you have to look at is the accelerator actually giving you the instruction, the information, the classes, the contacts, and all the other things you have. I was a part of 500 Startups. 500 Startups is run by my old friend Dave McClure. They don't have the same level of brand as Y Combinator, but probably you found it extremely useful. And so, what you have to do is you have to decide for yourself, how much do I value these things? If you say, I'm joining the accelerator so that VCs want to put money in, then apply to Y Combinator, and if you don't get in, forget it, right? Because the other accelerators aren't going to help you that much in that regard. They'll help, but they won't help that much. If you're looking for framework, structure, knowledge, mentors, then by all means. Talk to it, go look at the other accelerators, and most importantly, talk to the graduates of the accelerators, and most importantly, talk to the graduates of the accelerators who shut down, and find out what they thought. Because everyone feels good when stock price and revenues and everything else are going up. This was one of the principles. There is a venture capitalist who shall go and fund who shall remain nameless, because I've already gotten myself into enough trouble tonight. But this is a venture capitalist and fund where twice, with two different companies that I was either advisor or investor in, this venture capitalist screwed the company over and caused enormous problems. And actually, I was an investor both times, as well as an advisor. And the first time it happened, I was surprised. The second time, the entrepreneur came to me and said, hey, I'm thinking about doing this round, what do you think? And I said, close your door. You didn't hear it from me, but I had a bad experience with this investor before. He basically went nuts and screwed the company over. I'm telling you, don't take the money. He said, he ended up taking the money, and he got screwed out of his CEO position, and the guy ran the company, the VC ran the company to the ground. And I asked him afterwards, I told you what to watch out for, and I told you what was going to happen, and you didn't listen. What happened? He said, well, I talked to his references, and they were all glowing. He said, in retrospect, what I realized, I talked to the references, and they're all the companies that were successfully acquired, and they were all really happy with the VC. And I never talked to any of the companies where things went south, and then bad things started to happen. So same principle applies. Talk to companies that are graduates of an accelerator, but failed. And it could be that the founders are bitter and unfair to the accelerator. Maybe. I haven't met many founders that are like that. I think you'll get good, honest information that'll be very useful to you. Is it absolutely necessary to have a tech co-founder to raise seed funding? No, but if you don't have a tech co-founder, you better have a product into the marketplace and traction in the marketplace. Because the point of a tech co-founder is to reduce the technology risk associated with the company. Tech co-founder reduces the technology risk because you have somebody who is able to iterate the product and make changes and make stuff happen, because you are never going to get it right the first time. Whereas if you're paying an outside firm to build the product for you, every time you need to make a change, you have to pay, and guess what? You're going to have to make a lot of changes. And so as an investor, I would say a lot of technical risk there, a lot of technical risk. But if the company is already out in the marketplace and doing well, then obviously, by definition, the technical risk is largely being eliminated. Okay. Do you recommend startups find seed money before launching their product, or is it best to raise money afterwards? It's best to raise money afterwards. Here's the reason why. As I described before, once you raise money, you start spending it. You may not, if you haven't launched your product yet, you don't know how long it's going to take you to launch a product. I've seen horror stories of companies that have raised money and failed to launch their product before running out. You're really screwed. Even if you do manage to launch your product, you probably don't have enough time to really prove it out. And so you find yourself raising money before you have any proof points. If you launch your product and you start generating traction and then you raise your seed money, you actually know what, you can actually put that seed money to good use, and you're going to be in a much better position to generate enough proof points to raise more money, because never in history has there been a company that raised just seed money and then managed to exit for $1 billion, as far as I know. There may be companies that have bootstrapped and exited for $1 billion outside of Silicon Valley, but I doubt there's any company in Silicon Valley that raised $250,000 and then exited for $1 billion. Tell us about some of the companies you have funded, and why did you fund them? That is an excellent question. A very good question. So I'll tell you guys some interesting stories, and different companies get funded for different reasons. And I'll include examples I'll include at least one or two examples of companies where the CEO and founder is a woman, because I think that's also instructive. So a couple of companies that come to mind. One company that I've invested in is a company called PhoneHalo. PhoneHalo is very similar to a company that you may have heard of called Tile, that's been doing a lot of press recently. Basically, they make these devices that hook up to your phone and keep you from losing things. It might be your key, might be your wallet, might be your luggage. PhoneHalo has actually been around for a lot longer than Tile has, it just hasn't done as much publicity, and it has actually probably more traction in the marketplace. I met these guys at the Hacker Dojo's inaugural startup fair. So it was just an experiment by the Hacker Dojo down in Mountain View. And the idea was, let startups show off what they're doing, and people randomly will go around and look at the startups and go vote and decide which one's their favorite. And I went to see these guys, A, because I know a lot of the folks from the Hacker Dojo, and B, because as an investor, I believe it's really important not to wait for like Y Combinator demo day or any of these demo days, because by then it's too late, but to go out and find companies really, really early and to get to know them, rather than having to decide after a demo day, okay, it's demo day, you have 1 week to decide, go. So I met these guys who started PhoneHalo, and they had developed this technology, and it was a technology that I really, really loved, because when I was an undergrad at Stanford in the early 1990s, one of my friends proposed this idea. We just didn't have any idea how to actually make it work. And so I was like, oh my God, Bluetooth, the smartphone, it can actually work. This is really amazing. And but I didn't invest in them right away. I stayed in touch with them. I talked to them from time to time. Eventually they said, hey, a couple times they would come up. They were actually in Santa Barbara. Sometimes they'd come up and I'd spend, a couple hours working with them, giving them free advice. And eventually they said, we're getting all this free advice from you. We should probably make you an advisor. I'm like, I don't object to free stock. So I became an advisor and continued to help them. And eventually they said, well, we'd like to raise money, and can you invest in us? And I said, well, let's figure out what the terms are and come to a negotiation. And this whole process took, between the time I first met them to the time I actually put money in, it probably took about 2 years.
Wow.
But the reason I invested in them is that whole time they were making progress, despite having no money. And despite being two guys who were just undergraduate engineering graduates from UC Santa Barbara, great school, wonderful, right on the beach, but not exactly a Silicon Valley hotbed. And these are still are soft-spoken guys, not the grab them by the lapels, I'm awesome, and let me tell you about how we reached rounded profitability in 3 days, and we're growth hackers, and we're hustlers, and we're killing it. They're not like that at all. They're like, well, we've got this technology, it's pretty neat. Let me show you some of the things it can do. But they were continually generating traction, so they put out a first product, and it kind of sucked. And they put out a second product, and it sucked less. And they put out a third product, and it sucked a lot less. And they started getting deals. They had the folks at Cobra that make the radar detectors, OEM them, and start selling the product. They had Samsonite start putting it into their luggage. They had Verizon say, we're going to carry it in all the Verizon stores. They had Apple say, we're going to carry it in the Apple stores. And meanwhile, it's still these same soft-spoken guys, still with no money, doing all this. And so I said, geez, these guys are able to do all this with no money. Presumably with money, they'll be able to do even better. And more to the point, they'd already proven that they knew what to do and that they could drive results. A different example is WanderU. WanderU is a company based in Boston. And what you can essentially think of it as is Expedia for buses. So this was an interesting one. Somebody brought it to me. I'm like, what? Buses? Really? It turns out that buses have dramatically changed. Part of this is because of like the Google buses and things like that. But nowadays, long distance buses, even some of the Greyhounds, are now comfortable, have electrical power outlets on board, have Wi-Fi on board, and by the way, are incredibly less expensive than planes. And for many shorter distances, pretty equivalent because you don't have to go to an airport, rent a car, and do all that stuff. So I was intrigued by this. And what I said, this is an interesting, this is a bet. It's definitely a bet on a particular thesis, which is that more and more people are using buses. I looked into it and saw that there were more bus lines springing up. And I also saw that there was no coherent rhyme or reason to it, right? You go to like 5 different websites to figure out what their schedules are and how to get on which bus. I'm like, wow, that's crazy. And I had a friend of mine who is one of my business partners take the bus. So he's in Boston, and he's a venture capitalist. I'm like, you should take a bus down the next trip to New York. Don't fly, take the bus. Like, are you crazy? No, take the bus. Just do it. Just see what it's like. And he did. He said, wow, that was actually really good. I was able to get a lot of work done. It was really comfortable, and boy, it was a lot cheaper than taking the plane. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And so fundamentally, it was a bet that there are a set of trends going on that say that there are going to be more people taking buses. We have a trend away from car ownership, right? We see this with car share services and with Zipcar, Lyft, and endlessly. All right, well, what's the other logical thing besides car services? If you're traveling long distances, people had tried, and I in fact knew some people who are part of Y Combinator who tried to do ride sharing over long distances and it didn't work. There's the density within the cities to do ride sharing, but there isn't the density going LA to San Francisco or long distances. But there are these buses that are already going back and forth, and you can take a bus from Boston to New York and have Wi-Fi all the way, and it'll cost you something like $35 each way. So I'm like, okay, this is something interesting. This is already happening, and what this definitely needs an Expedia for buses. And in fact, it's even better than Expedia because there's no Sabre equivalent that actually allows every online travel agency to come up. Once they develop the relationship one-on-one with the bus lines, they'll actually have a competitive moat. And so this was one that had not yet generated a lot of traction, but had an appealing business model and had actually developed these relationships with these bus lines. And I was like, you know what, I'm gonna take a chance on this one. And the founder, Paulina, was a very charismatic founder, very good at generating press, had done a ton of work already to get featured in the Boston papers as a top entrepreneur, 30 under 30, all these things. I'm like, this person knows how to generate press, knows how to get awareness. And that's the main thing we're gonna need. This is not a technology play. It's not that hard to build an Expedia for buses. I mean, you have to develop API connections with all these bus lines, but it's not any rocket science. What you need to do is you need to go out and get people to actually pay attention and start taking it. So that's how that company got funded. Again, they got funded for very different reasons. And I probably feel more secure about my investment in Phone Halo because there's a lot more track record and progress along the way. But I did the other investment as well, so obviously they managed to make it over the bar. More questions left? Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. How do you reach ready-to-invest investors for seed capital in mobile, social health, and fitness space? All right. So the great thing is that AngelList now exists. Gives you a chance to see these angels. When I was starting to raise angel money, you just sort of had, it was like, one of these old movies where you go to a street corner and you're trying to buy illegal goods. Do you know anybody who's an angel investor? Anybody who might have money? And it was all word of mouth. It was terrible. And you had no idea if the person was a crook or they were actually investing. You had no idea if they actually invested in anything because they don't have websites. It's just some random guy. One of the guys, in fact, for my very first company, one of the guys we talked to about being an angel investor stole the idea and did it himself. He is actually a famous entrepreneur who's enormously wealthy. Again, I won't name his name, but it's like amazing to me. But he has been enormously successful, has made probably $100 million in his career. And again, he completely ripped off my idea and stole it for himself. He didn't make that much money off it though, so I'm like, I fooled him, I gave him a bad idea. Oh wait, I was doing it myself. Crash. But AngelList now has markets. You can see who's interested in mobile, social health, and fitness. But the number one thing I tell people about AngelList is if you're just starting out, don't go and start pushing on AngelList yet. What you want to do is you want to identify a targeted list of investors who can actually be lead investors. Because the vast majority of investors on AngelList are, like me, price takers as opposed to price makers. They don't invest enough money to actually set terms, but they don't want to just invest in whatever random terms an entrepreneur sets. Because then it's a party round and there's no bigger investor on the hook. We want the cover of a bigger investor to be able to sort of keep people in line if something goes wrong. And so the number one thing you got to do first is to get a lead investor, somebody who, if you're raising $250,000, is putting in $50,000 to $100,000. If you're raising $500,000, is putting in $100,000 and $250,000. If you're raising $1 million, is putting $250,000 or more. Because that person is a lead investor. There's all these reasons why that's important. The first is they'll set the price, so that other people can now take the price. The second is everyone will feel more comfortable because generally these lead investors are well known, and they'll say, there's a brand name associated with, there's somebody who's minding the store. And the third thing is when something goes wrong, and inevitably it will, you'll actually be able to potentially get more money out of them. So they've already put in $250,000. And you're like, we're just about to launch, but we've run out of money. We're kind of hosed. We're like, oh, okay, we're going to pass the hat around to the other investors, and we're going to raise another $200,000 so you guys can get out there. Because even though it's sunk cost, and theoretically I should treat that $250,000 as it's already lost, investors can't resist trying to save their investments. But if you have 10 people who've invested $25,000 each, none of them is going to lift a finger because they're just like, oh well, too bad. But if there's a lead investor who goes to all the rest of those investors and say, you better put more money in, or I'm going to tell everyone who, if you don't put money in anytime we're in a deal or somebody asks me, I'm going to tell them that you're a low-down skunk who doesn't support their investments. How about that? Put some money in. And that actually works. So that's why it's so important to get a lead investor. That's why on AngelList the first step is to get a lead investor. After you get the lead investor, especially once they're committed and they're on your site, it's going to be in their best interest to then help you reach other investors as well. So that's how you do it. And again, in terms of the space, AngelList has a markets function. Just look for people who have invested in something that is similar but not too similar. All right. How do you find and then ask someone to be a board advisor or an advisory board member? So first things, even though I advise a lot of companies, I always tell them that most advisory board members are a waste of time. The reason is they don't have enough time to really help you that much, unless they're stupid like me and spend more time than is justified. There's one company where I'm just an advisor, and I met with them like once a week for the past couple of months, and meet on weekends. I'm like, why am I doing this? This makes no sense. But what you do is you try, ultimately, assume that their name is not going to matter to the other investors, because the investors will call them up and they'll say, are you an advisor to the company? And they'll say, yeah. Do you do a lot with them? No. They're not going to lie for you. So ultimately, ask people to be on the advisory board if you think they can actually help you, if they have connections, if they're going to do something specific. Don't do it if you say, oh, they're going to spend 20 hours a week doing something for me, because they're not. But if they have high leverage contacts, high leverage expertise or something like that, then it's worth it. And how do you find them? You say, who would be the perfect person? And then you go out and ask them. And they may say no, but you'd be surprised sometimes that how people will say yes. The example I often give is I've worked with the Unreasonable Institute in Colorado, and it's an organization that's a quasi-accelerator. They help companies that are for-profit companies but have social impact, and they're generally drawing from people around the world, in Africa, Asia, all around the world. And they started something called Unreasonable at Sea, which was a cruise with these entrepreneurs and other people. and they called up the cruise ship company and said, are there any cruise ships which are not in use, or where there's like a route that they have to take anyways, or where there's unsold seats, unsold cabins? And they ended up getting a cruise line to donate all the cabins, so they paid nothing for the boat. Then the founder just emailed and called up anyone he thought who was really cool, who might be willing to go on the boat. And he ended up getting Nobel Prize winner and Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa to go on the boat for 6 weeks. Now, he was only going to go on the boat for a week, but he liked it so much he stayed for 6. Now, if you were to tell me, if somebody came to me in advance and said, I'm going to go get a Nobel Prize winner to come on a cruise with me for 6 weeks, I would tell them, you are out of your mind. There's not a chance that's going to happen. But it did. So find the absolute best person you could possibly imagine and ask them, because they might just say yes. How do you package a service into a product? This is an excellent question, because a lot of people start off with services, because services are easier to sell at the outset. They're generally easier to turn a profit on, and you don't need to do as much development. So how do you package a service into a product? The main way to package a service into a product is to try to see if there is commonality between the different service engagements that you do. Because ultimately, all a product is it's something that's repeatable. I mean, it almost doesn't matter if the product is an actual technology product or if it's a service delivered product. The key is it has to be scalable and repeatable, because otherwise it's you spending your time creating a new service each time. And ultimately, as far as I know, you only have 24 hours a day. If you find a way to have more than 24 hours a day, forget your startup, sell that instead. So you're going to look for commonality, and this commonality is in a variety of ways. It's the commonality in terms of the market that you're serving, so the demographics of the customer. Are they all law firms? Are they all real estate agents? It's also the activity that they're actually performing. So for example, it's generating a weekly report? Is it this? Is it that? And as you sort of see these patterns emerge, and you can sort of say, well, it looks like a significant chunk of them fit into this category, then you can start packaging the service into a product. Now, if the question is a slightly different one, which is how do you package services with a product, that usually isn't too difficult, because most customers are going to say, hey, I really actually need services to help use this product. Final question, are you open to hear viable startup ideas and provide feedback? Yes, although I tell everyone, I just archived another 3,000 email messages a day in email bankruptcy. I've done 15,000 messages so far this year. There are vast numbers of people who've probably reached out to me and haven't heard back from me. This will probably ruin my reputation, but there you have it. So I am happy to hear viable startup ideas and provide feedback. The note I will give everyone is the best way is to talk to me by telephone when I'm driving, because that time is wasted anyways, and I'd be happy to connect with you guys and figure out ways to help. So that is this set of questions. I suspect we're probably towards the end of our time. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. So I'll turn it back over to Dari.
Thank you very much.